The lobby of Monroe Medical Group was the kind of place that made people speak in quieter voices. Glass walls, polished floors, the faint hum of climate control doing its job too well. It was the sort of building that reminded you, without saying so directly, of the distance between floors. Raylan Pierce was on one knee beside an audio panel near the east wall, running a cable check before the morning's public announcement, when the group of younger employees drifted over. He knew what was coming before any of them opened their mouths. He'd seen that particular kind of boredom before, the kind that needed an audience and called it entertainment. "Hey, Pierce." Bennett Cross leaned against the column with his arms crossed. "You see her Monroe just walked in. Bet you won't go say something." The others laughed. Low, easy the way people laugh when they think nothing real is at stake. Raylan didn't answer. He set down his cable tester, wiped his hands on a cloth, and stood slowly. Celia Monroe stepped out of the private elevator at that exact moment, composed, unhurried, every inch the woman this building had been built around. Their eyes met across the lobby, and Raylan Pierce walked toward her. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Raylan Pierce was not the kind of man who made entrances. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered in the quiet way of someone who had worked with his hands his whole life. And he moved through Monroe Medical Group's hallways the same way he moved through most things, steadily, without announcement. His toolkit was old. His work boots were older. The younger technicians on staff had newer equipment and louder opinions, and Raylan let them have both without comment. What they saw when they looked at him, a black single father pushing 40 doing maintenance in a building full of people who wore badges that cost more than his monthly grocery run. What they didn't see, the man who used to own something. He'd had a small auto repair shop on Delmar Avenue for 6 years. Built the client base himself, learned every system by hand, took pride in the kind of work that didn't need explaining because the result spoke clearly enough. When his marriage ended, the debt didn't. He sold the shop, paid what he owed, and found steadier ground. A union position, predictable hours, a paycheck that arrived on time. He traded ambition for reliability because he had Calvin to think about, and Calvin came first. Calvin had always come first. His son was 11 now. Serious-faced, curious, the kind of kid who asked follow-up questions and remembered the answers. Raylan raised him in a 2-bedroom apartment that was clean, functional, and theirs. Most evenings, dinner was on the table by 6:30. Most nights, Raylan checked homework before he checked anything else. It wasn't a glamorous life, it was an honest one, and Raylan had made his peace with the difference. There were moments, usually late, usually after Calvin was asleep, when Raylan would sit at the kitchen table and feel the particular weight of a life that had been pared down to its essentials. Not miserable, not grateful in the easy way people perform gratitude, just aware. Aware that something had been set aside, and that the setting aside had been necessary, and that necessary things still cost something even when they're right. He didn't talk about it. There wasn't anyone to talk to, and he'd gotten comfortable with that. Celia Monroe was 32, and had been running this company for 3 years under circumstances nobody would have chosen. Her father, Gerald Monroe, had built Monroe Medical Group from a single community clinic into a regional healthcare network spanning 4 counties. He died of a stroke 18 months after his diagnosis, faster than anyone expected, and left Celia the company before she felt ready to take it. She had been ready in every measurable way, the education, the training, the years of working beside him. But readiness and grief don't always agree on timing. The board had watched her closely in those first months. Some of them had expected her to hesitate. She hadn't. She cut expenses that needed cutting, restructured 2 underperforming divisions, and held the company's direction with both hands. She learned quickly that warmth was the first thing people would use against her if she let them, so she kept it at a distance. Not because she lacked it, because she had learned the hard way that a woman running a room full of men who weren't sure she should be there could not afford to look like she needed anything from anyone. From the outside, Celia Monroe was efficient, composed, and largely unreadable. Her employees respected her in the way people respect weather. You don't question it, you adjust. What they didn't know was that she still kept a folded piece of paper in the back of her desk drawer. She had kept it for 7 years. She had never thrown it away, and she had never quite been able to explain to herself why, except that some things carry a weight that doesn't correspond to their size. And this was one of them. The announcement event had been on the calendar for 3 weeks. Monroe Medical Group was going public with its community clinic expansion program, a multi-phase initiative to upgrade underfunded health facilities across the city. The lobby had been arranged for it. Rows of chairs, a temporary stage near the north wall, press credentials clipped to lanyards, catering tables pushed against the glass. It was the kind of morning that made the building feel more important than usual, which was already saying something. Raylan had been called in an hour early. The audio system feeding the stage microphones had developed an intermittent fault the night before, one of the monitor speakers cutting out every few minutes without warning. He was tracing the signal path from the panel box when Bennett Cross appeared with his usual company. There were 4 of them, mid-20s all of them, the kind of young men who had figured out how to look busy without doing much. Bennett worked in client communications, which meant he spent most of his day on the phone and the rest of it finding ways to fill the silence. "You know she's doing the whole speech herself today," Bennett said, not quite to Raylan and not quite past him. "No PR buffer, just Monroe up there talking." Raylan kept his eyes on the cable junction. "I heard she turned down 3 different guys from the 7th floor," one of the others added. "Just nothing. Ice." "That's because she's selective," Bennett said, and the grin in his voice was audible. "Pierce." He waited until Raylan looked up. "What do you think? You want to try your luck?" The others found this genuinely funny. Raylan looked at Bennett for a moment, the way a man looks at something that doesn't require a response, and turned back to his work. "Come on, walk over there and say something. What's the worst that happens?" "I finished my job late," Raylan said flatly. More laughter. Bennett pushed further, the way people do when they've already decided someone is the joke and are just waiting for confirmation. He kept talking about how Celia Monroe didn't notice men like Raylan, about how this was just for fun, about how nobody would think less of him for trying, and everyone would understand if she shot him down. The unspoken message was clear. A man like you doesn't get a woman like that. This is entertainment, not possibility. Know your place and play along. Raylan had stopped listening. He was standing up slowly because across the lobby, the doors of the private elevator had just opened. Celia Monroe stepped out in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, a portfolio tucked under one arm, moving with the kind of focus that made people step aside without being asked. She was speaking briefly to someone from her executive team, nodding once, dismissing them cleanly. Then she looked up, and Raylan was already looking at her. The recognition was not gradual. It was immediate and complete, the way certain memories don't fade so much as wait and then surface all at once when the right thing triggers them. He knew her face not from her company portrait or the nameplate on the 31st floor. He knew it from a different hallway, a different building, a night when he had been sitting with a sick child and someone had sat down beside him for no other reason than that he looked like he needed it. 7 years. And she looked exactly like the woman who had talked him through the longest night of his life without once making him feel like he owed her anything for it. Celia had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with her usual composure. The portfolio shifted slightly under her arm. Her assistant said something to her and she didn't hear it. Raylan set down his cable tester. He wiped his hands once on the cloth at his belt. He crossed the lobby without hurrying, and when he stopped in front of her close enough that the ambient noise of the room fell away, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear it clearly. "You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in a hallway full of bad news." He held her gaze steadily. "And still the one I never had the nerve to call." The lobby did not go dramatically silent all at once, but the people close enough to see her face went quiet one by one, like a small wave moving outward from where the two of them stood. Because Celia Monroe, the woman this building had never once seen off balance, was standing completely still. And something in her expression had come open in a way that no quarterly report or board meeting had ever managed to put there. Bennett Cross, still standing by the column, had nothing left to say. The event proceeded as scheduled. Celia delivered her remarks cleanly, without hesitation, the way she did everything in front of an audience. The audio system held. The press asked their questions. The catering went largely untouched. By 11:30, the lobby had returned to its usual configuration. Chairs stacked, cables coiled the temporary stage broken down into its component parts. Raylan was finishing the last of his equipment checks when one of the administrative assistants came to find him. Ms. Monroe wanted to see him. 31st floor. When he had a moment, he rode the elevator alone, toolkit in hand, already composing a version of the conversation where he accepted a formal reprimand without argument and returned to work. He had stepped outside his lane. He knew that. Whatever had passed between him and Celia Monroe in that lobby was a private thing that had no business being performed in front of an audience. And if there were professional consequences, he would absorb them the way he absorbed most things, quietly and without making it anyone else's problem. The 31st floor was quieter than the rest of the building. Thick carpet muted lighting the sense of air being treated differently up here. Celia's assistant pointed him toward the corner office without a word. Celia was standing at the window when he came in. She didn't turn immediately. The city spread out behind the glass, flat, wide, mid-morning gray. "Close the door," she said. He did. She turned, then crossed to her desk and placed something on the surface between them. It was a small rectangle of paper folded twice, worn soft at the creases from being handled over years. Raylan recognized it before he picked it up. His own handwriting slightly rushed. The ink faded but still legible. A 10-digit phone number and his first name. He had written it on the back of a hospital intake form one morning in March, 7 years ago, at Northline Community Clinic, after a night he had not forgotten and had never expected to revisit like this. "I kept it," Celia said simply, without apology. Raylan set it back on the desk. He didn't speak right away. "I wanted to call," she continued. "About 2 weeks after that night, I had the number out and I was going to. Then my father had his first episode. Then the board started asking questions about succession. Then it was a year later and calling felt," she paused, "complicated. Like I'd be pulling someone into something they hadn't agreed to." Raylan looked at the paper on the desk. "I looked for you," he said. "Not right away, but I did. I knew your first name. I knew you'd been volunteering at Northline." He exhaled slowly. "A few months later, someone mentioned your father's name in connection with the clinic. Said Gerald Monroe's daughter had been doing shifts there. That's when I understood who you were." "And?" Celia asked. He met her eyes. "I was a man who'd just sold his shop and was figuring out how to keep the lights on for a boy who needed his father to have things figured out." He said it without bitterness, just as fact. "And you were going to run a company that your father spent his life building. I didn't think that was a door I had any right to knock on." Celia was quiet for a moment. The city moved behind the glass, indifferent and continuous. "I'm expanding the community clinic program," she said finally. "Phase 2 begins next month. I need someone on the assessment team who actually understands what those facilities need from the inside, not from a spreadsheet or a consultant's summary. Someone who has used them, who knows what it's like to sit in one of those waiting rooms at 2 in the morning and need it to work." She held his gaze. "I'd like that to be you. Not as a favor, not as something that changes what happened in the lobby this morning, because you're the right person for the work." Raylan looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the offer had time to be real, long enough for him to feel the full weight of what was actually being asked. It was not a small thing, and both of them understood it was not entirely about the clinics. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she replied. He picked up his toolkit. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back once, the way a man does when he's already made up his mind, but isn't quite ready to say so out loud. Then he left. Celia stood at her desk for a long moment after the door closed, looking at the folded piece of paper still sitting on the surface between where he had been and where she was now. She had carried it for 7 years without being entirely sure why. She was beginning to understand. He said yes. 3 days later. He sent the answer through the facilities coordinator in writing, the same way he submitted maintenance requests. Clean, formal, no excess. He accepted the role on the assessment team for the community clinic expansion. He would provide operational evaluations of each facility's structural conditions, equipment reliability, workflow issues that didn't show up in administrative reports. His input would be documented and submitted like anyone else's on the team. He set those terms himself. Celia accepted them without revision. Raylan understood the risk he was managing. The moment word moved through the building that a maintenance technician had been added to an executive initiative, people would start constructing their own explanations. Most of those explanations would not be generous. He could not control what people said. He could control how he conducted himself, and he intended to conduct himself in a way that left nothing open to reasonable question. He kept his distance at the office. He spoke to Celia in meetings the way he spoke to anyone directly without performance. He submitted his written assessments on time. He did not linger in hallways or seek out additional contact. Whatever existed between them personally was not something he was willing to let bleed into a professional context that other people were watching closely and storing carefully. What he hadn't anticipated was how difficult that discipline would be. The first clinic visit was a facility on the west side of the city. Raylan walked the building the way he always walked buildings, checking load-bearing points, testing outlets, running water in every sink to assess pressure and drainage, noting which repairs were cosmetic and which were structural. He was filling out his condition report in the pediatric waiting area when he noticed Celia standing near the far wall, not reviewing documents, not speaking to anyone on her team. She was looking at the wall where someone had taped up a hand-drawn mural, crayon animals in uneven rows, block letters, spelling out the names of animals that children had apparently decided the artist needed to know. The kind of thing made by kids who had spent too many hours in waiting rooms and needed something to do with their hands. She stayed there longer than she needed to. On the drive back, they sat in the rear of the company vehicle with a folder of floor plans open between them, and Raylan said without particular weight, "You remembered which rooms they were." Celia looked at him. "The kids' names. At the last 2 clinics. The staff mentioned them once and you didn't write anything down, but you hadn't forgotten a single one when you referenced them later." She looked out the window. "My father used to do that. He said if you can't remember someone's name, you haven't actually paid attention to them. You've just processed them." Raylan nodded slowly and didn't add anything. He didn't need to. The observation had landed where he'd meant it to, and they both understood that. It was on the 4th visit that something shifted in the quality of the silences between them. Not uncomfortably the opposite of that which was in some ways harder to navigate. They were reviewing a supply room inventory when Celia asked him almost as an aside what he thought of her office. It was the kind of question people ask when they're thinking of something else. Raylan considered it seriously. "Well designed," he said. "Good light, efficient layout." He paused. "But if you're planning to spend the rest of your career up there, you might want a chair that gives your spine something to be grateful for." Celia stopped writing. Then she laughed. Not the controlled, brief acknowledgement she used in conference rooms, but an actual laugh, unguarded and slightly surprised at itself. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it happens. Raylan watched it happen with the quiet attention of a man carefully storing something away. He turned back to the inventory sheet. But the corner of his mouth had moved, and he didn't correct it. The assessment coordinator who had accompanied them that day mentioned it to 2 people before they got back to the building. By the following morning, the administrative floor had heard that Celia Monroe had laughed, actually laughed, not smiled, not acknowledged, but laughed during a routine clinic visit with the maintenance technician. Nobody could quite agree on what to make of that, but everyone had an opinion. Northline Community Clinic was the 6th stop on the assessment schedule. Raylan had known it was coming. He had seen it on the list for 2 weeks and had not said anything about it to anyone. He told himself it was because there was nothing to say it was a facility like the others, it needed evaluation like the others. And whatever personal weight it carried was his business and not a relevant factor in a professional context. He was mostly convincing. They arrived on a Thursday morning. The building was older than the others. A converted storefront from the late 80s expanded twice, with different materials that didn't quite match the kind of structure that told its own history in uneven brickwork and mismatched window frames. The waiting area inside was narrow, the chairs worn smooth at the armrests, the fluorescent lights doing the best they could with what they had. A handwritten sign near the reception desk said the pediatric intake forms had moved to the second window. Someone had drawn a small arrow in red marker and underlined it twice. Raylan stood in the entrance hallway for a moment before starting his walkthrough. Celia came to stand beside him. She didn't ask why he'd stopped. 7 years ago, he said finally, Calvin was 4. He spiked a fever that wouldn't break, the kind that made him limp and quiet, which was scarier than the crying. I didn't have a regular pediatrician at the time. I was between insurance plans after the shop closed. This was the closest place open after 9. He walked slowly down the hall as he spoke, running one hand along the wall where the plaster had been patched and repatched in layers that didn't quite match the original color. We were here from about 10 at night until close to 4 in the morning. Calvin came down around 3. I was sitting in one of those chairs out there and I was... He stopped, chose the word with care. I was not doing well. I'd been holding it together all night for him, and the moment I knew he was going to be okay, something in me just stopped holding. He paused, and someone sat down next to me. Celia said nothing. She didn't ask if I was okay. She could see I wasn't. She just sat down and started talking about something else, something small and completely unrelated. I don't even remember the specific words. I remember the effect. It was like she understood that what I needed wasn't to talk about it, but to have someone be calm near me until I could be calm again. He turned to look at her. That was you. I know, Celia said quietly. You stayed until he was discharged. I remember every part of that night, she said. I've thought about it more times than I can count. They stood in the hallway without speaking for a moment. Down the corridor, a child was crying softly in one of the exam rooms. The low, tired cry of someone who had been at it for a while. A nurse moved past them with a clipboard, nodding once unhurried. I wanted to leave, Celia said eventually. Her voice was measured, but something beneath it was not. After my father died, I had plans, actual concrete plans to step back from the executive track and do something more direct. Clinical work or community health administration, somewhere I could see the results in front of me rather than on a slide. I had conversations with people about it. I was close. She paused. Then the board made it clear that without a Monroe at the top, they would restructure in ways that would dismantle everything my father built for the people he built it for. So I stayed. You made the right call, Raylan said. I made a necessary call. Those aren't always the same thing, and I stopped pretending they were about 2 years ago. He looked at her. Really looked at her. In the way he hadn't let himself do in the weeks of clinic visits and professional distance. It was the most unguarded thing he had heard her say, and she said it the way people say true things they have been carrying a long time. Not for relief exactly, but because the moment finally matched the weight of the thing. The expansion plan, he said, shifting his voice back to the work, but not entirely. The budget allocation in the briefing document's north line is getting surface work, paint new signage, updated intake materials. The electrical system in the East Wing is 15 years past its recommended replacement cycle. The HVAC unit in the pediatric room runs loud enough that a provider can't clearly assess a child's breathing in that space without asking them to hold still. Celia turned to face him fully. The clinics in higher income zip codes are receiving full structural upgrades, new equipment, full systems replacement. I've reviewed both sets of specifications. He kept his voice even factual. I'm not saying the disparity was deliberate. I'm saying the numbers show what the numbers show. Celia was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the patched plaster walls, the handwritten signs, the worn chairs visible through the doorway. People who have needed places like this, Raylan said carefully, know the difference between being helped and being used as the background of a good photograph. He didn't say it to wound her. She understood that immediately and completely, which was perhaps exactly why it landed the way it did, not as an accusation, but as something she already knew and had been working hard to look slightly to the left of. She stood in that hallway for a long time after he finished speaking, and the silence between them was the kind that happens when two people are both sitting with the same difficult truth, and neither one is willing to be the first to make it smaller. The rumors moved the way rumors always move in a mid-sized company, not all at once, but in increments, each retelling adding a small detail the previous version hadn't included. By the end of the second week, the version circulating on the administrative floor was that Raylan Pierce had been added to the expansion team because he'd said something to Celia Monroe in the lobby, and she'd been taken with him. The version on the facilities level was rougher. Bennett Cross had made sure of that. He wasn't loud about it. He was too calculated for loud, but he was consistent. And consistency in a closed environment does its own work over time. The implication in every version was the same. Raylan had found an angle and he was working it. A man like that always has an angle. Raylan heard pieces of it. He didn't respond to any of it. He had made a decision early in his adult life that he would not spend energy on people who had decided what he was before he opened his mouth. That decision had cost him some things over the years. It had also kept him intact in ways that mattered considerably more. He was 36 years old. He had raised a son, buried a business, and rebuilt a life. He did not have the time or the bandwidth to argue with Bennett Cross about his own character. What he could not dismiss as easily was Calvin. His son was observant in the careful way of children who have learned that the adults around them sometimes need watching. He noticed when his father came home later than usual. He noticed when Raylan sat at the kitchen table after dinner and didn't move to the couch. He had a gift for noticing the things Raylan didn't say and the patience to wait for the right moment. The right moment came on a Wednesday night while Raylan was cleaning up after dinner. "Dad!" Calvin was at the table with a textbook, open pencil in hand, not looking up. "Do you like Ms. Monroe?" Raylan kept wiping the counter. "What made you ask that?" "Marcus's older brother works in the building. He said people are talking about you." Raylan set down the cloth. He turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at his son, this serious-faced, patient boy who had learned that straight questions deserved straight answers and had been holding out for one. "I respect her," Raylan said. "She's a good person. We've known each other longer than most people in that building realize." Calvin looked up then. "That's not what I asked." Raylan held his son's gaze. "I know," he said quietly. Calvin considered this. The fact that his father had heard the actual question and hadn't answered it, and then nodded once and went back to his textbook. Which meant he was done for now, but not done. Raylan stood at the counter for a long moment after that, not moving. Celia had her own version of the same reckoning, conducted entirely with herself, late at night in an office that had no good reason to still be occupied at that hour. She was not afraid of Raylan. She was afraid of what her attention toward him might cost him. She had watched what proximity to power did to people in this building, how it changed the way others looked at them, how it invited speculation and reduced a person to whatever narrative was most convenient for the people doing the speculating. Raylan had built something careful and dignified out of circumstances that hadn't asked his permission, and she had no interest in becoming the reason that structure cracked. After the last clinic visit, she had wanted to invite him to dinner, something simple outside the building. She had talked herself out of it twice before she finally said it. His answer came without performance or self-pity, just the plain words of a man being honest about something difficult. "Not because I don't want to, because I want to too much. And I need to be sure this won't hurt my son." She had turned those words over in her mind for days afterward. Not with frustration, with something much closer to recognition. The particular quiet of a person who has spent years making decisions by thinking first about what they might cost someone else, and who has just met someone doing the exact same calculation from the other direction. She understood him completely. That she was finding was the most inconvenient part of all of it. The second public presentation was smaller than the first. No press credentials, no catering, no external partners filling the rows. This was an internal rollout. Department heads, senior staff, a handful of board observers seated along the side wall. The Phase 2 budget was being formally presented before going to the board for approval. Once the board signed off, the numbers would be locked. Raylan had no standing reason to be in that room. He had come to drop off updated condition reports with the facilities coordinator and had stayed because the door was open and the presentation had already begun. He stood near the back. He held his folder. He listened. The plan on the screen was thorough and well-designed. The slide deck was clean, the language careful, the projected photographs of upgraded facilities bright and well-lit. Raylan found North Line's line item in the budget column without difficulty. He found the East Wing electrical notation. He found the HVAC line, surface improvements, exactly as he had documented. He was already turning to leave when Bennett Cross, seated 3 rows from the front, leaned toward the colleague beside him and said something at a volume that was not quite private. Raylan caught enough his name, the word lobby, a short laugh from the people nearby, the particular sound of a joke that isn't really a joke. Celia, standing at the front of the room, did not react visibly, but her jaw had set in a way Raylan had learned to read. He stopped walking. He looked at the room, the board observers with their padfolios open, the department heads half present, Bennett Cross settling back into his chair with the comfort of a man who had never once worried about the cost of his own voice on someone else. Then he looked at the allocation slide still projected on the screen behind Celia. He walked back in. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. The room turned. Celia looked at him with an expression that held several things at once. "The North Line line item," Raylan said. He kept his voice level and unhurried. He was not angry. Anger would have made this easier to dismiss. The electrical system in the East Wing is running on infrastructure from 2009. The HVAC unit in the pediatric room produces enough ambient noise that a provider cannot conduct a proper respiratory assessment without asking the child to hold their breath. Those are not cosmetic problems. The plan as it currently stands addresses the appearance of those facilities. It does not address what people go there to receive. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something true has been said that nobody planned for. "I understand I'm not in a position to make budget decisions," he continued. "I'm telling you what I've seen, and I think some of the people in this room have not seen it." He held the silence for a moment. Then he looked at Celia, not as an employee addressing a CEO, but as one person looking at another across a distance that both of them had helped create. "I spent a long time thinking I didn't call because the distance between us was too wide," he said. "I've come to think I was wrong about that. I think we were both very good at standing too far from the things we actually believed in." He reached into his breast pocket. He removed his employee badge. He set it on the table beside him, not with theater, not with anger, but with the quiet finality of a man who has identified the thing he cannot agree to and has stopped agreeing to it. "I'm not leaving because I was asked to," he said to the room. "I'm leaving because I don't know how to stay quiet about something like this, and I don't think I should have to learn." He picked up his folder. He walked to the door. Behind him, the room held its breath. The board observers, the department heads, Bennett Cross with his mouth slightly open, and Celia Monroe standing at the front of it all, hands at her sides, watching the door close behind the only person in the room who had said exactly what he meant. For the first time in 3 years, she did not know what to do next. And for the first time in longer than that, she understood that not knowing was the most honest place she had stood in a very long time. The question was whether she was willing to do something with it. Celia did not go home that night. She stayed in the building after everyone else had cleared out, moved through the quiet 31st floor to her father's old office at the end of the hall, the one she had kept locked for 8 months after he died, and had only begun using again recently because it had the better window and she was tired of punishing herself for missing him. She sat down behind his desk, turned on the single lamp in the corner, and did not open her laptop. On the wall across from her was a photograph she had looked at hundreds of times without fully seeing it. Gerald Monroe, younger than she remembered him being, standing in front of the original North Line clinic on its opening day. He was not in a suit. He was in a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, standing between a pediatric nurse and a man in his 70s who had been the clinic's first patient. He was not posed. He was laughing at something the old man had said, and his whole face was in it. Not the careful, public-facing smile of a man conscious of the camera, but the real thing. Celia looked at that photograph for a long time. Her father had told her once she had been maybe 16, somewhere in the middle of an argument she couldn't now reconstruct, that the most dangerous thing a person in a position of power could do was become more loyal to the image of doing good than to the actual doing of it. She had written it in a notebook she still had somewhere. She had quoted it in her MBA thesis. She had cited it in her first address to the board. She had apparently forgotten to apply it. She sat in that office and allowed herself to be honest, in the way that is only possible when there is no one watching and nothing left to manage. She had known about the budget disparity in the allocation plan. She had reviewed the line items. She had told herself that the first phase needed to be viable, that perception mattered for sustained funding, that you couldn't fix everything at once. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had been afraid. Not of the board, not of the numbers. Afraid that if she pushed too hard for Northline and the other underserved facilities, she would be seen as sentimental, as soft, as a woman who let personal history cloud financial judgment. She had spent 3 years making sure no one could call her soft, and in doing so had quietly made herself into something her father would not have recognized without difficulty. She thought about Raylan setting his badge on the table, not throwing it, not making a speech designed to be remembered, just placing it down and walking out because some things were not negotiable, and he had known which ones those were long before today. She thought about a folded piece of paper she had carried for 7 years. She thought about a man sitting in a plastic chair at 2 in the morning, holding a sick child and trying not to come apart, who had still managed in the middle of all of that to be gentle. She picked up her phone. She opened a new document. She started writing. Not a memo, not a press release. A restructured budget with real numbers in the Northline column and honest language about why the previous version had missed the mark. She worked until the city outside the window started to get light again. When she finished, she sat back and looked at what she'd written for a long time. Then she sent it to her assistant with instructions to schedule an all-hands for 10 o'clock. She had a lot to say. She was done finding reasons to say less of it. Raylan's apartment was quiet when he got home. Calvin was still awake, sitting on the couch with a book open in his lap, which meant he had been waiting without wanting to appear to be waiting. He looked up when his father came in, read something in his face, and didn't ask what happened. Instead, he got up and retrieved the old metal toolkit from the hall closet, the one Raylan had carried since before Calvin was born, dented on one corner, the latch repaired twice with mismatched screws. He carried it to the coffee table and set it down in front of his father and sat back down. "You always say a good man fixes what can still be fixed," Calvin said. He looked at the toolkit, then at his father. "Is this one of those things?" Raylan sat down slowly. He looked at his son, this boy who had his mother's eyes and his own stubbornness, and apparently a better sense of timing than most adults Raylan had ever known. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it might be." Calvin nodded once and went back to his book. Raylan sat with the toolkit between them for a long while, not opening it, just letting the weight of the evening settle into something he could work with. Celia sent the memo at 6:40 in the morning. It went to the board observers, the department heads, the facilities coordinator, and the external contractors already engaged on the expansion project. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, and it did not use the word oversight as a euphemism. It said directly that the Phase 2 allocation plan had prioritized facilities in higher-income service areas in ways that contradicted the program's stated purpose, that this had been identified through on-site assessment work, and that the budget was being restructured before board approval was sought. She attached Raylan's condition reports for Northline and 3 other underserved clinics. She did not soften the language in them. Then she booked the main floor meeting room for 10 o'clock and sent a second notice company-wide from the lobby reception team to the 31st floor that attendance was open. By 10, the room was fuller than she had expected. There was no stage, no slide deck, no catering, no press lanyards. Celia stood at the front of the room at floor level, a single printed document in her hand, and waited for the noise to settle. She saw Raylan near the back. He had come. She hadn't been certain he would, and seeing him there, standing quietly with his folder, watching her with the same level attention he brought to everything, steadied something in her. 3 weeks ago, she began, we announced a community clinic expansion program. The language we used was about equity and access, and continuing what this company was built to do. She paused. The budget we drafted did not reflect that language. I reviewed those numbers and I approved them. And that is a failure of judgment I am not going to attribute to process or circumstance. The board observers along the side wall had gone very still. My father opened Northline Community Clinic in 1987 with borrowed equipment and a staff of 4. He did it because people in that part of the city were traveling 40 minutes each way for basic care, and he thought that was wrong. That is why this company exists. She set the document on the table. I had allowed that reason to become a footnote in our investor materials. I don't intend to continue doing that. She outlined the restructured plan without embellishment. Full electrical replacement at North Line. HVAC upgrade in the pediatric wing. Structural assessments at 4 additional underserved facilities. Budget reallocated from 2 cosmetic renovations at higher income locations that had been included primarily for optics. When she finished, the room held its quiet. Then Celia looked toward the back of the room and her voice shifted, still clear, still steady, but no longer in CEO register. It was something more direct than that. 7 years ago, she said, I was volunteering at Northline on a night shift when a man came in with his 4-year-old son. The boy had a fever that had been running for hours, and his father was holding himself together by the thinnest margin I had ever seen in a person. I sat with them until morning. She held Raylan's gaze across the length of the room. That man showed me what it looks like to take care of someone when you are nearly out of the capacity to do it, and you do it anyway. I have been trying imperfectly to hold on to that lesson ever since. She stopped. The room waited. I should have called, she said quietly. To him and to herself, and to the years stacked between that hospital hallway and this one. I had every reason to, and I didn't. That was also a failure of judgment, and one that cost more. Raylan pushed off the wall. He walked forward through the quiet room slowly until he was close enough that the rest of it fell away. I should have looked harder, he said. I told myself it wasn't my place to. I was wrong about that. Celia looked at him steadily. We wasted a considerable amount of time. We did, he agreed. I'd rather not waste more of it. Raylan was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, just giving the moment the weight it deserved. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not for the room, not dramatically, in the plain, certain way of a man who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. Then we won't, he said. Northline Community Clinic closed for 3 weeks in the fall for renovation. Not the kind that shows up in press releases. Not the kind designed to photograph well and remain cosmetic underneath. The East Wing electrical system was replaced, entirely new wiring through walls that had been carrying too much load for too long. The HVAC unit in the pediatric room was pulled out and replaced with a system quiet enough that a provider could hear a child breathe without asking them to hold still. The waiting area got 12 new chairs, not decorative, not chosen for a catalog, but the kind with proper armrests and adequate back support that people who spent long hours in waiting rooms had been needing for years. The hand-drawn mural on the pediatric wall was preserved. The contractor who led the crew asked about it on the first day, and Raylan told him to work around it. He did. Raylan's new title was Community Facilities Program Manager, longer than he would have chosen himself, but Celia had pointed out that the length of a title sometimes determined how seriously a contractor took a phone call, and he had conceded the point without making a thing of it. He oversaw the assessment and renovation schedule for 7 clinics in the first phase, managed a team of 4, and spent most of his days in the field rather than behind a desk, which suited him considerably better than the alternative. He was good at the work in the way people are good at things they have been doing informally for years, without anyone having the sense to attach a title and a budget to it. Bennett Cross stopped him in the hallway one morning in November. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing something and was less certain of it now that the moment had arrived. "Pierce," he said. Then, after a pause that carried its own weight, "I was out of line. Earlier this year, more than once." Raylan looked at him evenly. "I know," he said. Bennett absorbed the absence of absolution with visible discomfort. "Next time you want to challenge someone," Raylan said without heat, "challenge them to do something that matters. The world has plenty of the other kind already." He kept walking. Bennett did not follow. Celia came to Northline on the day it reopened. She did not announce it in advance, and she did not bring anyone from communications. She arrived 20 minutes before the first patients came through the door, walked every room with the clinic director, asked questions, and wrote down the answers and shook hands with the staff the way her father had shaken hands, looking at the person in front of her, not past them, toward whatever was next. Raylan was in the pediatric wing checking the HVAC calibration when she found him. "It's quiet," she said. "That's the point," he said. She stood beside him in the small room, both of them listening to the absence of noise. And it was enough. They took it slowly, and slowly suited them both. Dinner with Calvin on Sundays, walks after work when the schedule allowed, conversations that moved at the pace of people who had already lost time and were no longer interested in rushing through what remained. Calvin had decided he approved a conclusion he communicated not with words, but by asking Celia one evening whether she knew how to play chess, and then spending 40 minutes explaining the board to her with the patient authority of someone who had given this lesson before and expected to give it many more times. Raylan watched from across the table and said nothing. He didn't need to. On a Tuesday morning in December, Celia found him in the Monroe Medical Group lobby, running a routine check on the audio panel near the east wall. The same panel, the same corner, the same man. She stopped beside him. "If no one had dared you," she said quietly, "would you have ever said it?" Raylan sat back on his heels and looked up at her. He gave the question the seriousness it deserved. "Probably not," he said. "Men like me sometimes take half a lifetime to say what should have been said on the first day." Celia looked at him for a moment. "Then I'm glad someone said something stupid," she said. Raylan stood. He was almost smiling. "So am I," he said. The lobby moved around them, badges swiping elevators, opening the ordinary machinery of a building doing its ordinary work. And in the middle of all of it, two people who had spent years at the edges of each other's lives simply stood together without drama, without apology, without any further distance between them. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. There's something this story keeps coming back to that I think a lot of us carry around without naming it. The idea that we don't deserve to step into someone else's life, that the gap is too wide, that we'd be a burden, that people like us don't get to want things like that. Raylan didn't lack confidence. He lacked permission, the kind we give ourselves or refuse to. And Celia didn't lack feeling. She lacked the courage to let it show in a world that had taught her that showing it was the same as losing. Most of the time, we're not actually afraid of rejection. We're afraid of what it means if we try and fail, what that says about who we are. So we make the decision for the other person. We step back before we've even stepped forward, and we call it wisdom, or realism, or knowing our place. But sometimes the most dignified thing a person can do is say the true thing out loud, even when the room is watching, even when it costs something, even when it's 7 years late. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you forgot to call, or something you talked yourself out of, or a version of yourself you'd like to find again, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the kind of story we tell here, every time. Hit the button and stay with us.